Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm your tutor of entrepreneurship, Professor Henry Buisa of Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology. This is part 2 of my series on Can Bukusu culture afford to be studied? Part 1 can be found at this link. That is where part 1 can be found. This is part 2. I want to repeat, I'm no anthropologist, I'm no historian, I'm no expert in culture. And therefore, as I attempt to answer the question, can Bukusu culture afford to be studied? I'm using my own life history. I consulted some documents, have listened to some people, have observed some rituals, and attended ceremonies, and analyzed discussions on a Bukusu caucus WhatsApp wall. This enabled me to apply my own logic to generate this series of my story. Now this is part 2 of my continuous story. In part 1, at that link, I looked at the division of culture and an accusation from a Bukusu funeral orator and advisor that the Bukusu who build modern houses with internal toilets are violating Bukusu culture. Now to him, using internal toilets is akin to excreting in the house, and that is taboo in Bukusu culture. But when you listen to him further, he actually says that is only related to men. If a man excretes in the house, then that is anti-Bukusu culture. But a woman can go ahead and excrete in the house. He argues that indeed, when women are giving birth, there is that possibility that the pain can make them, also excrete in the process of giving birth. So the Bukusu culture allows women to excrete in the house, but not men. Now, in this part 2, I look at a brief history of the Bukusu. Like I said, part 1 is captured at that link. Now, Bukusu origin. The Bukusu are a Bantu people, and the Bantus are said to originate from the west and north of Africa. Look at those red arrows, red lines. Said some originated from Egypt, others from the Cameroon in the west, and the Bantu came to East Africa. They are even in South Africa. Bantus are all over Africa, and the Bukusu are part of Bantu. Now, I did not find one universally accepted story of the Bukusu history. Some say the Bukusu descended from Mwambu and Sela in the long past. Others say the Bukusu became distinct from the rest of the Luya in the late 18th century. The emergence of a subnation, a history of the Bukusu to 1990 by Professor Simiyu, suggests that the Bukusu could have split from the Bakishu of Uganda in the 14th century. Like I said, different people give different versions. Now, in the East African Red Book, a Greek writer, William Shkoff, mentions Esivakala a 60 AD market town of Mundus in the southern parts of Egypt. Professor Bethwell Ogot, in his work History of Southern Luo, 1967, and Fred Makila, An Outline History of Bukusu of Western Kenya, 1978, suggest that Esibakala was one of the earliest gathering of descendants of Mundu, who is said to be the great ancestor of Bukusu. Now, Esibakala is said to have been fertile, and the Mundu's people, also called the Babai, practiced agriculture and kept chicken, cattle, goats, sheep, etc. Babai even domesticated dogs for security and hunting. They grew finger millet, sorghum, as well as indigenous vegetables. But maize, called nasimia in Bukusu, was unheard of. So the Bukusu never grew maize in those early days. Maize was introduced not to Bukusu but in Kenya in the 19th century. Sukuma wiki or kales were also not among the indigenous vegetables at Esibakala, which were like saka, sucha, and so on and so forth. Some historians say that from Esibakala in Egypt in 60 AD, the Bukusu moved to Esirende in Sudan in 800 AD, and later in the 14th century or thereabouts, they came to Mwiyalawamango in Kenya after having settled in various places between the Sudan and Kenya. Since culture can only be as old as a people, Esibakala of the 1st century will be my Bukusu culture reference point, at least for this video or for this story. Now, we can trace, or let me trace the approximate Bukusu movement and settlements. There it is, the red trek from Egypt up to Kenya. Egypt, 60 AD, Esibakala. Bukusu are traced from there. In 800 AD, they were seen at Esirende in Sudan. From Sudan, they moved to Enambukutu, Lake Turkana, on to Embai Silikwa, Cherengani Hills. And finally, in the 14th century or thereabouts, they settled at Mwiyalawamango, near Bungoma. So this is the story. 60 AD to 14th century. Now, as the Bukusu kept moving and settling, they must have been adopting, adapting, abandoning, and even creating some new cultural practices and elements. This is my logic, this is my hypothesis. This I derive from what experts say about the impact of physical features such as landforms, climate, and natural vegetation on culture. You can get this information at that source. For example, climate affects crops grown by a people and consequently their food, and food is a pillar of culture. Inhabitants in mountainous areas with caves will practice specific rituals, and the rituals as an element of culture. Hot coastal areas dictate the clothes worn by people living there, and clothes are an element of culture. Therefore, this makes me make this hypothesis that since the Bukusu were moving from place to place, Egypt, the climate of Egypt, clothes must have been different probably, the food, down up to the present Uganda with all those different topographies and physical features, Bukusus must have been adapting, adopting, abandoning, and creating new cultures, because geography has a bearing on culture. The place people live has a bearing on culture. Now, if I were again asked to list the key pillars of culture, I would list food, housing, clothing, rituals. Of course, there are more. So these are my 4 key pillars: food, housing and language, clothes, and rituals. Now, in part 3 of this story, I look at food as an element of culture.